Hello to you again out there in my audiobook listening world. This is Tony Denton coming to you once again from the Phoenix, Arizona area this April 11th, 2019 at about 9:30 in the morning. And I'm going to share with you the 15th installment of my audiobook series on my book Hebrews From Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled. We are looking at chapter 6 of Hebrews, verses 13 through 20 today, finishing out chapter 6. And if you have the book and you're following along in it, that begins on page 109. In Hebrews chapter 6, 4 through 12 that we just looked at last week, Paul wrote concerning the impossibility of being saved without Jesus, the very one who was the fulfillment of the old law to which they were returning, something which was obviously an illogical action for them to be taking. Since Jesus was the hope of Israel, Paul in verse 12 brought in the idea of inheriting the promises made to Abraham. Promises that could and would only be realized in Jesus, the one they had previously confessed as the Christ, but were now leaving behind. Due to this habit of theirs, as it's called, in Hebrews 10 verse 25, referring to them as a corporate group, Paul in chapter 6, 13 through 20 urged his weakening first-generation Jewish Christian readers to imitate those who, through Abrahamic faith and perseverance, were experiencing the fulfillment of the promises. So, verse 13. For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. Since they were becoming discouraged by the long delay of Christ's coming, for as Peter indicated he was expected to come in their generation, 2 Peter 3 verse 4, Paul alluded to their father Abraham's faith and perseverance, chapter 11, 9 through 10 and 39. The emphasis of Hebrews 11, which has been dubbed Faith's Hall of Fame, is the long outlook of true faith, involving patient waiting and endurance. The example of Abraham demonstrates that the promise of God is certain. In other words, Paul was saying, you think you've had a long wait, just think of your father Abraham, who has yet to receive the fulfillment of the promises that were made to him directly. The idea of God swearing means that he confirmed his promise, verse 13, and this oath was made on himself since he literally is the ultimate being. In Genesis 22:16, God said, by myself I have sworn, which would be for him like saying, I give you my word of honor. Here's a side note for you. It's interesting that this oath was made to Abraham after Isaac was around 25 years old, meaning that it didn't include the birth of Isaac, but all the blessings which would flow through him. Okay, verse 14, saying, surely blessings I will bless, and multiplying I will multiply you. That's God's oath to Abraham. This type of repetitious wording is a figure of speech meant to emphasize. In other words, God was going to exceedingly bless and multiply Abraham and his seed. This same idea is found of Jesus when he is said to be the King of kings and Lord of lords in Revelation 19 verse 16, meaning that Jesus is the kingliest king and the lordliest Lord. It's also found in the phrase, Holy of Holies, meaning, as the New King James puts it, the holiest of all, Hebrews 9:3, or the most holy place, Hebrews 9:12. The blessing of the promise was not only that Abraham's faith would be accounted to him for righteousness, but that the faith of his seed would likewise be accounted to them for righteousness. For Paul wrote that God, foreseeing that he would bless the nations by faith, preached the gospel to Abraham beforehand, saying, in you all the nations shall be blessed, Galatians 3 verse 8. Verse 15, and so after Abraham had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. The word for endured is the same root translated patience in verse 12, actually referring to perseverance, something active, not mere patience, something passive, at least the way we usually understand the word. And by the way, to patiently endure is the opposite of being sluggish that we talked about in the last installment of our series. Since the word for obtained carries with it the idea of something merely lighting upon a person, it indicates that Abraham didn't personally receive the entire fulfillment of the promise, but only a touch or a taste of it, such as in the birth of Isaac and some of his descendants. But another way to look at it is this. Just as multiplying Abraham referred to his descendants, so his reception of the promise was fulfilled through his descendants. And still another way of looking at it can be found in John 8:56. Jesus said that your father Abraham saw my day and was glad. More than likely, this means that Abraham saw the Messiah by the eye of faith, as referred to in chapter 11, verse 13. Alright, verse 16, for men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Paul is illustrating the certainty or security of God's promise by alluding to his oath. God meant to put an end to any doubt by confirming his promise with an oath. Why bring this up? Because since time immemorial, man has employed the use of oaths upon those greater than himself, usually God or his word, in order to settle a matter. Oaths, therefore, have become solemn. Oaths tend to cause people to think or say, okay, as long as you swear, I trust you. The point is this: if people feel like they can bank on what a man says on an oath to God, surely he shouldn't only accept what God himself says in an oath, but he should also feel completely secure in doing so. Abraham did, and he didn't even live long enough to see the entirety of the promise fulfilled. Paul said that he died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, was assured of them. Chapter 11, verse 13. But unlike Abraham, these brethren were on the verge of finally experiencing the fulfillment of long-awaited promises. Here's a side note for you. The difference between a promise and an oath is that in a promise a simple claim is made, while in an oath someone's character publicly and solemnly supports that claim. In a promise we look at words, while in an oath we look at the person, whether the oath taker or the oath supporter. Check out Romans 1:9 and 2 Corinthians 1:23 with that. Verse 17. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of the promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath. The clause, thus God confirmed it by an oath, means that, think about this remarkable concept now, God submitted himself to his creation's own universal oath-taking custom. By stating to show more abundantly the immutability of his counsel, Paul was saying that God disregarded the implied distrust in his word alone and took the oath. He just could not make it on anyone other than himself. See, a man makes an oath on someone greater than himself, such as God, because he's in essence saying that if he's lying, he acknowledges the right of this greater one to punish him. But since there's none above God to punish him if he were to lie, he, to appease man, did all he could possibly do by taking an oath on the very same person men do, himself. So if men trust themselves to make an oath on God, then surely men can trust God to make an oath on himself. The word immutability means unchangeableness. God wanted Abraham and all his physical and spiritual heirs to know that he's not a turncoat. To Timothy, Paul succinctly said that God cannot deny himself, 2 Timothy 2 verse 13, and James said of God that in him is no variation or even a shadow of turning, chapter 1 verse 17. The term for counsel refers to a proposal based on one's desire. In other words, God proposed and promised certain things to Abraham based on his desires for mankind, then he took an oath to fulfill them. The term for confirmed here is different than the one for confirmation in verse 16. While the previous one merely means to produce confidence, this one means to pledge oneself as a surety. In other words, since God couldn't take an oath on anyone greater, he, by swearing upon himself, became the security deposit for the sake of the promise. Similarly, Jesus, being the covenant himself, Isaiah 42:6 and Isaiah 49:8, in a twist of irony, is the surety for the new covenant. Compare chapter 7, verse 22 of Hebrews. Interestingly, since Paul here was headed back into his discussion of Christ's high priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, there's a very distinct possibility that this verse about the oath of God to Abraham and his descendants includes his oath concerning Jesus' priesthood. In chapter 6, verse 20, Paul again brought up Psalm 110, verse 4, where God spoke of swearing that Jesus will be a priest forever. This is a very smooth transition, moving from Melchizedek in chapter 5, 6 through 10 about Psalm 110, verse 4, to a warning against apostasy in 5:11 through 6 and 12, to Abraham as an example of faithfulness due to his trust in God, chapter 6, 13 through 19, then back to Psalm 110, verse 4 about Jesus and Melchizedek and Abraham's connection to him in chapter 6, verse 20 through chapter 7, verse 10. That's a masterful piece of writing. Even though Paul was one of those who would jump back and forth at times, he was still good to make a smooth transition from one thing to another, in a lot of cases, or maybe even most cases, like he did here. Alright, verse 18. That by two immutable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. The phrase two immutable things either refers to two oaths, the one to Abraham and the one about Jesus' priesthood, or to God's promise and his oath, verse 17. There's not really a way to know for sure. Regarding the idea that it's impossible for God to lie, Numbers 23:19 reads, God is not a man that he should lie. Has he ever promised and not carried it through? That's the New Living Translation. Since the word for strong refers to a barrier to resistance like an army or fortress, and since the word for consolation refers to encouragement resulting in solace, the phrase strong consolation might be better understood as a fortress of encouragement. Peter once said, the Lord isn't really being slow about his promise as some think, 2 Peter 3:9, New Living Translation. And this was right after he spoke about those who expected him to come back and deliver them in their generation and were complaining that he wasn't fulfilling his promise, verse 4. So, since God made a promise, took an oath, and cannot lie, they had no excuse for their lack of continuing to press onward, no matter what they were enduring, Hebrews 13, verse 6. They had no good excuse to be going backwards. The phrase, have fled for refuge, is the same as used in the Greek version of Deuteronomy 4:42, where it speaks of fleeing to a city of refuge. There were 3 of those on each side of the river Jordan. These brethren had accepted Jesus as Messiah, so they were headed for God's eternal city of refuge, complying with John the Baptist's statement to flee from the wrath about to come, Matthew 3, verse 7. Verse 19, this hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil. The word anchor is from the term anchoron. As one can see, anchor, like baptism, is actually a transliteration, a Greek word in English letters. Paul was telling them that their hope was their anchor, or their anchoron, something that was found on ancient coins as an emblem of hope. The anchor of their hope was sure and steadfast, Paul said, meaning that it was totally secure and that the chain could not break, and the anchor could not slip off its mooring. And into what place did Paul say this anchor, or this chain, or this hope extended? The presence behind the veil, or more literally, the place behind the veil, the most holy place. Consider this. The veil of the temple represented Jesus, Hebrews 10:19 and 20. So when he died, the veil of the temple was torn in half in order to signify his death, Luke 23:45. But not only that, for man through Jesus is now invited into the very presence of God, chapter 10:19 through 23, John 14, verse 6. However, since the full glories of that invitation wouldn't be realized until Christ's high priestly work was completed, then the veil also signified a transition Christ was making from one covenant to another, from the covenant of sin and death to the covenant of reconciliation and life. In other words, by AD 70, after generation of grace for the Jews, everything connected with the old law was totally and finally removed by Christ, thereby completing God's scheme of redemption. Thus Paul was communicating to them that because their Messiah, through his death and resurrection, was in the Father's presence preparing their spiritual residence that Jesus talked about in John 14:1 and 2, they, based on God's promises and oaths, had no good reason to forsake their confession of Jesus. Alright, verse 20, the last verse of our installment today. Where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus, having become high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. There are 2 reasons indicated here as to why Jesus is a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Firstly, Melchizedek's priesthood, as opposed to Aaron's, has no end, implying that man has no end, for there's no reason for a priest if there are no humans, right? Ecclesiastes 1:4 and Psalm 148 verse 3 and verse 6. As Paul said in chapter 7 verse 3 of Hebrews, Melchizedek, because there was no recorded genealogy for him, had no beginning or end to his days. Secondly, Levitical high priests were never thought of as forerunners, which is probably why, according to the original, Paul didn't place a definite article before forerunner. Rather, they, wearing 12 gems on their vests of their 12 tribes of Israel, were merely representatives of the individuals who couldn't even approach the tabernacle, much less enter its holy and holiest places. Even the priests weren't allowed to follow the high priest into the most holy place of God's presence, reminiscent of High Priest Jesus telling his disciples, "Where I am going, you cannot come," John 13:33. Or, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now," John 13:36. Why? Because the new and living way, Hebrews 10:20, wouldn't be completely paved until AD 70. But once it was, then as Jesus said, "You shall follow me afterward," John 13:36. And they did. Jesus went on to tell his disciples, "Since I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, you may be also," John 14:3. In other words, once his high priestly work was finished in the real Holy of Holies, and once the old law of sin and death was totally and once for all removed, then they'd be fully accepted into God's presence as heavenly citizens. This helps us to understand that, at one time, if anyone besides the high priest entered the Holy of Holies, he'd die, Exodus 28:35, and confer also Exodus 28:43 and Numbers 18:1 and following. But now, because of Christ, we can live in the presence of God, meaning that through forgiveness, our relationship to Him has been established in such a way as to provide us with reconciliation and therefore eternal life. By the way, I have an entire study on John 14 verses 1 through 3 on my website, asightforthelord.com. You can find that on the web page that deals with end times passages. All right, now as we end, I'm going to go to page 311 of my book, where I will read to you my translation of Hebrews 6 verses 13 through 20. "For when God made his promise to Abraham, he, since he could swear by no one greater, swore by himself, saying, 'Assuredly I'll bless you richly and greatly multiply your seed.' And thus, having demonstrated fidelity, Abraham obtained the promise. For men swear upon one greater than they, and an oath for confirmation is to them an end of all dispute. So, willing to go the extra mile to establish the certainty of his covenant to the heirs of the promise, God cemented it with an oath, in order that, through two acknowledged deeds in which it was impossible for God to be deceptive, we who flee for refuge may have great encouragement while laying claim to the hope that's lying just before us. This we have as a secure and strong anchor of life, originating within a sanctuary behind the veil, wherein the forerunner, Jesus, has entered on our behalf, having become high priest throughout the age in the order of Melchizedek." So, there we are again. We are at the end of another installment number 15, and I appreciate your being with me as I did another portion of my audiobook of my book, Hebrews from Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled. Be with me again next week as we talk about the next section, beginning at chapter 7, verse 1. Have a great week.